Welcome back, everyone. So as we begin the second half of today's program, our next session turns to one of the most urgent questions facing this industry. How ready is the travel retail for the scale of technological change already underway? Now, we often talk about innovation in terms of possibility, but for business leaders, the more difficult question is preparedness. Are our organizations moving fast enough? Are we building the right capabilities? And are we thinking strategically enough about what future readiness really means? So that's the theme of this session. Forward momentum, powering the next travel retail experience. And to explore it, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Hyunjin Kim, INSEAD Professor of Strategy, will bring a strategic perspective to the choices that will shape competitive advantage in the years ahead. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kim.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, as we just talked about, the world is changing at a very fast speed. And every major technology wave starts with the same mistake, where we ask, how do we fit the new technology into the old business? When the internet arrived, we asked, how do we put the brochure online? And when mobile arrived, we asked, how do we shrink the website into the app? And now, with AI, a lot of companies are asking the question, how do we automate pieces of the business that we already run? But most of the breakthroughs really come when we stop asking the question of how to fit the new technologies to improve the old model, and when we start asking the question, how do we think about the new models that become possible with these technologies? And so, what I'd like to explore with you today is this question of thinking about not just what is the AI that travel retail is going to adopt, but what are the changes that can come in terms of how AI can transform what travel retail could be? And the vantage point that I come to this question with is three different aspects. One is that I'm a strategy professor who studies empirically, thinking about how does AI change how we build companies and how we compete. And also thinking about an AI venture lab that I run at INSEAD, where we work with thousands of high-growth tech startups that are at the frontier of this wave. And then lastly, as an AI advisor to leading tech platforms, as well as some of the Fortune 500 companies that are thinking about navigating this big transition as we see these new technologies pop up. Now, one of the things that have been especially striking over the last few years, having been someone who built and invested in machine learning startups back when most people would ask me, why would you work on something called machine learning? Is that the pace of change that we're seeing is no longer linear. The first type of change that we're seeing that is accelerating is really at the capabilities level. When we look at what AI systems can do on a year-to-year basis, these capabilities are advancing incredibly quickly. So here I'm showing you a chart from Meter, which is an organization that estimates and measures what the capabilities of these frontier AI systems look like. Now, on the y-axis, what they measure is the length of a task that it takes a competent human being to do that a frontier AI model can do reliably. Now, 3 years ago, the answer was just a few seconds. A year ago, a few minutes. This year, the tasks that these frontier AI models can do reliably is about 3 hours that it would take a competent human being to do. So these capabilities are estimated to be doubling every 3 to 6 months. And if this trend continues, this means that by 2027, these frontier AI models should be able to do tasks that last the entire workday. Now, capabilities are not the only thing that are shifting very quickly. What we're also seeing is that this is one of the technologies that is being adopted at an incredibly fast pace. So to reach 100 million users, the telephone took 75 years. It took the mobile phone about 16 years, the internet, 7 years, ChatGPT, 2 months. And that tells you the pace at which the change is really moving day to day. Now, because of this pace, a lot of companies are asking the question, what do I adopt? What are the technologies that I need to adopt to make sure that I don't run behind? Of course, that's a reasonable question. What I want to tell you today is that the question is less about what to adopt or whether to adopt. The important question is how to adopt AI to move you into this transition. And the vast majority of companies are focusing on figuring out what tools to adopt to optimize the business that they have today. Very few are rethinking what are the strategies that become possible as these capabilities become available to us as a company. And I'll talk about 3 key parts. The first is, what does this mean in terms of the key shifts that you're going to see in your industry over the next few years, in terms of how AI is reshaping the various different pieces of what you do? The second part will be about how each of these shifts require you to reimagine the business. Because AI capabilities rarely, if ever, automatically translate into business performance. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what are some of the concrete examples that I can leave you with in terms of what reimagining the business with AI can look like. Okay, so let's dive in to the key shifts. The first shift that we're seeing is really at the technology layer. And this you're all intimately familiar with, which is that travel retail is entering a technology-rich era. You're flooded with many, many different technologies that touch every piece of what you produce to how you interface with your customer. From the latest version of real-time pricing, to biometric gates, to self-checkout, to augmented reality try-ons and different ways to personalize. And the response across the industry has really been this rush to adopt a variety of tools, to experiment, to pilot, maybe put it into production. These are all of the tools that come out across all of your industry reports and your annual reports over the last few years, really thinking about what are all of the tools that we can race to adopt. But a more fundamental shift is happening, which is at the customer layer. The way in which you interface with the customer is being rebuilt. Over 30 years, the way that customers have found what they wanted to buy is through search. I might say, what I'm really looking for is a luxury perfume, and I might type that into the browser, which of course has been one of the latest operational shifts in this industry, or tell an assistant, this is what I'm looking for. Now, search is being replaced by conversation, which is intent-driven rather than knowing exactly what I want in the moment, where actually, I'm not looking for a luxury perfume. What I'm looking for is a present for my mother-in-law that is going to fit into my carry-on and that's not going to exceed my liquids license. And now, conversation is increasingly being replaced by agents that go beyond the conversation and giving you recommendations of what that present might be so that you can then go and purchase it, to actually taking the action on your behalf. What it might look like is something like, you want a present for your mother-in-law? Here, I've reserved you something at gate B7. Now, customer-to-agent interaction is not the only thing on the horizon. What we're seeing is that agent-to-agent commerce may be the next step. One of the most exciting and interesting projects that I've seen in this space was by Anthropic, one of the leading labs in terms of these frontier models. They ran a project called Project Deal in the last quarter. What did they do? They basically launched 69 AI agents that were representing different employees within the company. They learned about what each employee cares about, what are all of the objects that they have that they could potentially trade with other employees. And then they set loose these agents with a $100 budget to go and negotiate, to buy, to sell on behalf of their employees. And what ended up was 186 deals that got made, transaction value of about $4,000. They randomized which model represented which employee, and they found that the better models ended up getting a lot more value for that employee. Now, what this is showing is not that agent-to-agent commerce is going to happen within, the next few months. But what it suggests is that increasingly, if more decisions are becoming mediated by agents, this is going to fundamentally change the customer relationship. How they think about search, negotiation, discovery. And as this happens, how do brands remain visible to the customer? What does it mean for a retailer to actually influence that search and the buying process? And if the customer relationship is increasingly owned by that agent layer that both learns and steers how purchase decisions get made, then how does that change how you approach building the customer relationship? Now, a third shift is even more fundamental in terms of changing how we build companies. So one of the most fascinating things that I have been seeing over the last few years is that having been in the startup and the venture capital space for many, many years, we're seeing economics of starting a company change in a way that we have never seen before. So here is just a handful of companies, many of which you may have heard about in the last few years. Cursor, for example, is an AI-powered coding agent. Now, they reached $100 million in annual recurring revenue in 21 months with just 20 people. Midjourney, an image generation company, reached revenues of $200 million with just 10 people. Lovable, which is a vibe coding app, reached $10 million in annual recurring revenue in just 2 months with 15 people. This shows how tiny teams can now operate at the reach and ambition of much larger companies. And they're able to scale at these incredible speeds, getting large amounts of revenue with very limited labor, very limited capital. And in fact, these are not just isolated outliers. What we're seeing in our research is that across 50,000 startups, which really sort of signal in the earliest level of what the economics of building these companies might look like, is that AI-native firms have 25% fewer employees compared to non-AI firms at the same stage. So what that figure shows you in red is AI-native startups. What you can see is that they generally have from about 0 to 25 employees. The mass is concentrated somewhere between 0 and 5. On the other end, in blue, are non-AI startups. And we've censored this at 50. And what you see is that the vast majorities of these companies have 50+ employees. What this suggests is that scaling no longer requires the same headcount in order to be able to scale both your revenues and the customers that you serve. And in fact, we're seeing this also across hierarchy. When we map the number of hierarchy layers that these companies have, of course, managerial capitalism arose in part to be able to manage the mass production that we saw in our society. And yet, we're seeing the exact same pattern, where AI-native startups are 15% flatter compared to the non-AI startups, suggesting that scaling also no longer requires the same hierarchy that we used to require. Now, what do these 3 shifts mean at the technology layer, at the customer layer, and at the firm layer? Each of these shifts requires reimagining what you are as a company and how you build your business. Yet the vast majority of companies are thinking quite narrowly when it comes to AI. So this report comes from our friends at OpenAI. Ronnie Chatterjee is a chief economist there who has been releasing a number of great research reports about the usage of these technologies. Now, what you see is that 40% of ChatGPT usage is writing. That's the pink line at the top. The rest of it is different ways of getting information. And this very much mirrors what I see across many different companies that I advise or teach or I talk to, which is they're thinking about investing in AI. They are asking their employees to adopt very, very quickly. Investment has been, of course, rushing in. And what are they doing with this incredible capability? Well, they are improving their emails. They are getting some notes for their sales calls. They are using co-pilots, building more and more chatbots. Every company now has a chatbot. This is really narrow thinking in terms of where AI might be able to change your business, and in part, why we really haven't seen the performance gains arise from these large investments that companies are making. And the missing step in all of this usage is to think about where does AI map in your own production process? Where are the bottlenecks that currently constrain you in terms of growing your company, in terms of how you create value as a business? So to test this directly, what we did was run an experiment with about 500 high-growth ventures from around the world. We ran a 3-month program where we equipped every single company with all of the technologies, all the tools, and the training that you could want. They received about $25K worth per company of API credits from leading labs like OpenAI and Google, et cetera. They had 3-hour weekly training from computer scientists at MIT and Harvard, and then they got a lot of mentorship and VC exposure. The only thing that we randomized in half of the groups was that we provided half of these ventures with different examples of how AI native companies mapped AI into their own production process to reorganize the company. Why did we give examples? Because best practices, 1, don't yet exist. 2, your own company-specific process of value creation and what makes your company deliver the magic that it does is very, very different. You need to figure out where those bottlenecks are. So how do we get companies to explore and search more broadly beyond the co-pilots and using ChatGPT for email? You do that by giving a lot of different examples to let them explore. And what we found was that when firms solve this mapping problem, the economics fundamentally change. We see that they dramatically increase the number of AI use cases that they have across the firm, and these use cases become much broader. It goes in beyond research and writing to strategy, to product development, to rethinking how you engage with the customer. This doubled the revenues of the average company that was in our treatment group, and in fact, they experienced this growth with 40% lower demand for capital. And what this suggests is that while there's so much focus on adopting tools and investing into getting the access and adoption solved, the breakthrough is really around solving the mapping problem, understanding how AI can unlock bottlenecks in what your company actually produces. And the most interesting result is that it doesn't just lift the average company. The gains are the biggest at the top of the revenue distribution, meaning that it lifts the ceiling of what's possible. We see these outlier companies that are able to generate these superstar revenues that simply are not possible in the control group. What this suggests is that this creates superstars and the advantage compounds as you unlock bottlenecks in your own production process. Now, what does this reimagining then look like in practice? I'll give you 3 examples. The first example is a company called Phase Shift. What they do is they build AI agents for the very messy, manual, back-office process of accounts receivable. Basically collecting all of the cash that you haven't yet gotten, matching different accounts. Now, what could they have built as a product? They could have built a chatbot that helped the many accounts receivable teams work faster, draft those collection emails, flag overdue customers. What did they do instead? They did something very different. They built an autonomous AI finance team. They basically mapped the accounts receivable process from end to end. Where were the bottlenecks? The bottlenecks were in matching the name of the company, the account, to the actual money that comes in. It was in the person who was actually entering in all of the data into the spreadsheets. And they automated each of these bottlenecks, which meant that they could actually simply use the product to get companies paid rather than as a software that actually helps accounts receivable teams. And so they created an entirely new product category, leveraging the fact that AI turns tools into teams, and they reimagined the product. A second example is Gamma. The way that I like to explain Gamma is that they are a presentation-making company sitting on top of 20 different models. My first job, the way that I started my career, was actually as a McKinsey consultant. Now, what we used to do in that time was that I would draw out what the slide should look like. I would fax it over to a shadow economy in India. I would get back in the morning, beautifully set, of designed and formatted slides. Now, Gamma does that with a single prompt. And what does this do? This changes the business model. What used to be a services-based business, where creating one more deck required more people, and they charged by the hour or by the project, where the growth was really essentially tied to headcount, ultimately shifts to a SaaS-based economics model, where more decks just require more compute. You type in a prompt and you get a deck. And this allows Gamma to serve 70 million users who are creating over 1 million decks per day with just 50 people, because they're importing capabilities of the model into the company. And so this means that services turn into software. And essentially what Gamma is doing is reimagining what the business model can become with these AI capabilities. Last example is Bark. Now, they're a retail company. What do? They put together a subscription box of dog toys and treats that they started about 15 years ago. And so when AI came along, what did? They optimized that box. They optimize their operations, and they optimize their services that they provide across the company. But they discovered something bigger, which is that their relationship with the customer was much bigger than that box. And that allowed them to rethink what their company was about, from we sell dog toys and treats to we make dogs happy. And here is one of the things that resulted.
The future of travel is here. World-class dining. Critically acclaimed in-flight entertainment. Custom lay-flat beds with 4 times the legroom. And coming soon, Tailwinds, the first ever in-air dog park. Introducing Bark Air. Finally, dogs will fly the way they've always deserved to. First.
If you think this is a joke, you're not a dog person.
Bark Air, a 100% totally real airline for dogs.
All right. Wonderful example. And in fact, Bark Air has been one of the key growth indicators in their business, and it was booked out as they rolled it out. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight here is that AI didn't deliver the airline. What it delivered was the freedom to imagine it, along with a number of other services that it allowed Bark to pursue. And what I want to emphasize for this example is this, which is once you have that freed operational capacity, then you can think about how can you reimagine the brand to think about what your brand can now become. And so 3 different examples: a new product for Faceshift, a new business model for Gamma, a new brand for Bark, each of which asks the question, what can we build now that wasn't possible before, instead of how do we sell better? And what we're seeing is that the firms that are pulling away in this wave are not the ones that adopt the most AI in their operations. They're the ones who are changing their strategy because of it. And so you have a choice. You can either optimize the current model that you have and run faster, or you can reimagine the future of what you can become. And I'd like to leave you with one question to take home. If you were building your current business from scratch today with AI, what would you build? What are the products, the business models, and the bigger brand narrative that you could dream up? Thank you so much.
Professor Kim, what an inspiration. So while they set up, you've inspired us to reimagine the future. Can I get you to elaborate for business leaders here? What are the early critical steps to get going? And what are the early mistakes to avoid?
I think the biggest critical step that I'm seeing across companies is to really think about experimentation. I think one of the challenges of this technology is that we're at the early stages of this technology wave. The capabilities of the technology are changing quickly, and yet you need to figure out what decisions to make in your business. We don't yet know what the best practices are. We're figuring it out as we go. What does that mean? You need to figure out a way to experiment widely and quickly with low cost, to think about letting 1,000 flowers bloom and then picking up the flower that actually ends up really lifting up.
So experimentation sounds nice. I've invested in Microsoft Copilot or Claude for my employees, but I remember the CEO of Lufthansa saying in frustration, we have more AI pilots than we've got pilots. How do you go beyond pilot experimentation to really transforming a business?
I think there are a lot of challenges and a lot of pitfalls that many companies fall into when they approach AI pilots. The first one is that typically these pilots and experiments, and I don't know in the Lufthansa case, of course, is mandated from top down, not from bottom up. Now, what does that mean? It means that typically they're rushing to think about experimenting in the fastest cases and where they may not necessarily have buy-in and coordination from the rest of the organization. And of course, that coordination is the most important piece when you're trying to turn a pilot into an actual implementation within the business. And that, I think, often is a key pitfall that companies fall into, sort of mandating it top down. The second one is thinking about what are the key steps that you need to train and take your organization to be able to lead in whatever workflow they do with these new technologies, to go from just piloting the technology to actually working with it day to day. One of the big challenges is that because these tools are changing so quickly, all of your employees actually have a full-time job, which is not playing around with these technologies and exploring what their capabilities could be. So how do you then make the space and make the information and make the training and time available for them to be able to actually make that transition and learn how to then put it into production rather than simply playing around with it, as a pilot?
Wonderful, fascinating. And maybe finally, you've shared how AI can help you go from searching for that luxury perfume to recommending something specific for your travel. But for travel retailers, you're a target demographic. You probably take 100 flights a year, going through dozens of airports every single year. How can we use AI to predict that is the day you want that special present for your mom?
It's a great question. You know, what I would say is that I think that's the wrong question to ask. You don't necessarily just want to think about predicting whether or not I want, that is the day that I'm going to want to buy that present for my mom or my mother-in-law. I think the biggest thing that everybody in the room has to think about is you have that 40 minutes from when a customer enters, goes through the gates to then boards their flight. And you're right, in some ways, I would love for you to solve my problem of actually wanting to go to travel retail when I am stuck in the airport across those hundreds of flights for 40 minutes, instead of trying to spend the least time possible in the airport as I try to minimize that travel experience. How do you reimagine those 40 minutes? What does it look like? Right now, for many, many decades, what it's looked like is that you are trying to get the customer to, be free from all the other distractions and go purchase that thing that they might have had in mind. How do you actually reimagine what those 40 minutes can look like? Does it mean that actually those 40 minutes are not used just to have these concession stands where people can already buy products that they already had in mind, where you're rethinking what that experience could be? Could it be that you actually think about that experience as a 40-minute blip in a much larger journey, which is that all of you brands actually know these customers for much longer than the 40 minutes that you're in that airport, to really think about and anticipate what could be the needs. In fact, for Mother's Day, I might have forgotten that Mother's Day was coming up, and how can you make sure that you actually help me rethink my entire experience? And I think that's the work that has to be done. Retail is an industry that has changed dramatically over the last century, from a cultural shift of thinking about, say, when we had the Selfridges moment of making the retail experience really as theater, from having the retail channel, omni-channel retail, as well as these platforms that mediate the purchase and the operational experience. What does it look like now to reimagine this retail experience and to think about what you can do for your customer and what are the things that you want them to experience through your brand?
Fantastic. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Hyunjin Kim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Really.